Hello. How's everybody this morning? Day 3 of APA. Are you guys exhausted yet? As someone organizing a panel, I can tell you that I am exhausted, so if I fall asleep afterwards, please don't think less of me. It's great to have you all here today. We're really excited. We're really honored that you've chosen to spend what may be a bit of a bleary-eyed Monday morning with us on a difficult, challenging, but I hope interesting and worthy of your attention topic: climate migrants and refugees. So my name's George Benson. I'm just recently graduated from the University of British Columbia's Planning School. I work for the Vancouver Economic Commission, which is the economic development arm of the City of Vancouver. I'm here with a number of my colleagues. Some of our friends from the school are here as well. We're joined by Sally Cox, my colleague Anna Zwo, Shireen Karoubi, and Kristen Edwards is part of our team as well. We're a loose affiliation right now calling ourselves the Climate Migrants and Refugees Project. It's an ongoing collaborative that we've started at UBC that's in its infancy, but starting to work towards understanding some of these issues around climate migrants and refugees, and we look forward to having you along on the journey with us today. So before I get started on anything, I'm actually going to start with something that in British Columbia, where we're from, is very common amidst any convening or conversation like this, which is to do a land acknowledgement. British Columbia is currently situated on a number of unceded traditional territories of different First Nations that exist within Canada. And we understand that in the New York context, in the United States, obviously that's very different, but we feel it's incumbent upon us to acknowledge the Lenape Algonquin peoples whose land this traditional territory is. So thank you very much again for being with us today. And I'm going to start with a little bit of somber news, unfortunately, that Ronald Jameau, who many of you probably saw in the program today, the ambassador of the Seychelles to the United Nations, unfortunately was unable to join us at the last minute. He had to go quickly to Germany for the lead up to the Conference of Parties meetings in Bonn there. So he sends his regrets and his sincerest apologies for not being able to make it. I'll be filling in with some of the content that he provided with us to try and give you guys a sense of the global relationships and policy frameworks that are relevant to this topic of climate migrants and refugees. So we're going to run this panel in, I'd like to say, 5 parts. We're going to provide a little bit of introduction and context just around the idea of climate migrants and refugees. These are maybe terms that you've heard thrown around a little bit over the past few years. We're going to provide some context there, and my colleague Shireen Karoubi is going to do that. Then I'm going to come in and talk a little bit about the international policy discussions and agreements that exist in this area. They're confusing and complex, but I'll try and keep things brief and at a high enough level that there's still some coherency there. Then Sally Cox from the Alaskan state government is going to be talking about her experiences in climate change planning with regards to different tribal groups. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And then finally, Anna Zwo is going to be closing off with a case study from Vancouver, British Columbia, which looks at what we think is an emergent best practices in this field of climate change migrants and refugees. And I'm going to end on that thought there with some overall framing for our conversation today, which is that we're here to start a conversation with you. We're not coming with any predetermined ideas of how we face up to the immense challenge that climate change migrants pose. We're here to draw on your experience, your ideas, your knowledge, and report back. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that process looks like as we conclude. But our final portion will be taking a few questions from you and discussing how we together can learn about this challenge and start to derive ideas about how to move forward. So with that, I'm going to conclude my little introduction here and hand it over to Shireen Karoubi, who's going to provide the initial framing comments. Thank you so much again, and I hope you enjoy yourselves.
Hey. Okay, so considering the subject matter of this panel, I think it's safe to assume that everyone here believes that climate change is real and is somewhat familiar with it. So I'm not going to focus too much on that. Instead, I'm kind of going to go over quickly the consequences of climate change that's having on communities right now. Okay, so one of the consequences that climate change is having is on food. So there's the increase in drought is bringing about desertification, which is making really difficult to farm in Africa and Asia and also the UK. Farming production has been reduced dramatically there, and so they're seeing less amounts of food supply. Another consequence is seen in water. Melting glaciers are causing water supply disruptions and often loss in communities that rely on Himalayan glaciers. And sea level rise is also a major concern. Sea level rise and storm surges puts coastal communities in a particularly vulnerable situation. So our response to climate change needs to include both mitigation and adaptation. Continue to reduce our greenhouse gases while preparing for a loss in food supply and water, and starting to think about what are we going to do with these destroyed communities, where are they going to go? So we have to adapt for that. So northern countries especially, they have to account for their role in climate change. We have a lot of emissions, and it definitely was a contributing factor in the climate change that we're seeing today. So the purpose of this panel is to partially remind us that we will face problems that will cause us to have to adapt, but we still need to reduce our greenhouse gases and know that it's still a possibility to stop where we are. So both have to kind of go together. So this map is a visual representation of the areas most likely to be challenged by climate change. The 4 types of areas most likely to be threatened include low-lying and delta areas, which will face sea level rise. Areas susceptible to desertification, this causes both a disruption in food and water supply, as I mentioned before. Areas prone to weather-related disasters, such as hurricanes happening to coastal communities. And northern areas with permafrost and fragile Arctic ecosystems. Here, permafrost keeps the ground stable, and entire communities have built infrastructure on that ground. And some areas that may be especially impacted include Bangladesh, a country which is basically at sea level, and sea level rise will definitely challenge this community. And in northern Canada and Alaska, we will see permafrost melt. This will cause a change in food chains, and as animals are going to migrate to different areas. Additionally, with sea level rise, communities are going to have to face erosion. So it's important to remember that that the neighboring countries of these threatened communities, they're not always going to have the capacity to accept these migrants to come in. Because of that, northern communities, like North America and European countries, may have to prepare themselves to face this influx of refugees because we have a greater capacity, even though we're maybe further away. So in our research, we found that the distinction between refugee and migrant it's pretty important to make, especially the definitions. So refugee gives an impression that you're being forced out of your home, you don't have a choice, you just gotta go. Whereas migrants, you think that there's more of a choice in the matter, and it gives the individual a bit more agency. So the agency associated with the term migrant implies that there are resources available to them that allow them to make the decision to leave their homes. The danger of using migrants when speaking about individuals or families that were forced to leave because of climate change, this kind of shifts the responsibility away from the international community and puts it on the individual, which isn't good because currently right now the international community, the responsibility is to protect refugees. So we have to use it when appropriate. So the sense of responsibility is especially important to northern countries because of their vast amount of emissions that they're causing right now. And you may be thinking that a quick solution, or one of the solutions may be for the UN to expand their definition of refugee to include climate migrants, but they're a little hesitant to do so because by them expanding the definition, they feel that it may overwhelm the international community and undermine the current existing refugees right now. But the ground is shifting on these definitions, and the uses may change in the future, but for now we kind of have to work with what we have, a current understanding of refugee and migrant. So yeah.
Jack. Thank you so much, Shreen. As Shreen said, these definitions are highly contested and come from, in some cases, literally decades of layering on top of different protocols related to refugees coming out of the Second World War, being layered on top of developmental concerns. There's a huge amount of, let's call it accretion, that has come over time of these different policies. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that at the global level here. So again, thank you so much, Shreen, for teeing us up here. So I'm going to lay out very briefly for you all some of the major policy pieces that exist at the global level around migration, and specifically the intersection between climate change and international migration and refugees. As you'll see, I think, over the course of what I have to say here, the main takeaway the main takeaway I want to leave you with is that this is a very fragmented conversation that involves a lot of different actors and policy areas that don't often speak to each other. And I think it's a testament that as urban planners, here we are talking about global migratory flows, global refugee flows, which is not something that, at least in my planning education, I was necessarily keyed up to immediately. So these are all forces that are moving around, and in many ways it's going to be beholden on us as a profession to say, we have a stake in this, we want to be responsible stakeholders, and let's see what we can do to add our part and our skill set to this, to responding to this challenge. So just to reiterate what Shireen was saying, climate change is here, it is real, it is happening, and we can look at the impact of that in terms of the number of natural hazards that are causing losses of lives and, and assets. So climatological events, extreme temperatures, drought, wildfire are increasing. Hydrological events, floods, mass movements of water are increasing. Meteorological events, tropical storms, convective storms, other storm forms are increasing. Each of those has had a precipitously larger impact on population movements, and people are responding as a result. One of the most startling statistics I think we came across in the course of our explorations with this was that 1 in 4 states has received or not returned someone from a disaster-affected country. You can imagine the panoply of countries that would be covered under that. African, North American, European, Asian, South American, these countries are all over the world that are receiving these migrants, many of which are not covered, as we saw, under the definition of a refugee. They've left for one reason or another related to some sort of climate change related disruption, and they have no international legal protection that understands the driving force of their migration. And this brings me to this key point. There is no standard definition for climate migrants in legal terms. This is very important to understand. We have all kinds of terminologies in policy literature and academia around what a climate change migrant, what an environmentally displaced person, what an internally displaced person looks like and what that means. But when it comes to crossing a border and you say, yes, hello, I've lost my home, my family, my job, my livelihood, maybe my community doesn't exist anymore, I'm a refugee, and they say, do you have a well-founded fear of political violence or religious discrimination against you? And they say, no. They say, well, you're not a refugee. So the lack of a legal definition here is one of these singular challenges that faces people in this community. And it's also a reason for a lot of political caution in this case, because the expansion of the definition of refugee to include climate migrants, if we look at some of the projections around what the numbers of climate migrants we may see in the future, the literature, I should say, is very much contested, and there is no standard number that is provided as an expectation, but numbers anywhere from 200 to 1.5 billion in the next century. So if you start thinking about a legal definition covering people who have a right to move and have protection under that legal jurisdiction, you can see why a number of countries, particularly us in the north, would be hesitant to provide that. And as I just said, with these the numbers varying so wildly, a lot of this discussion around climate change migrants has been framed in very apocalyptic terms. This is the kind of image I think that you'll most often see when we talk about climate change migrants. People bereft of all of their possessions, moving in a hurry, not having any ability to respond to the challenge that's been put for them, and being, in essential terms, victims of circumstance. And there's two parts of that that are important to remember. These people are not victims in any sense of a natural disaster. Climate change is a human-caused phenomena, one that we in the North bear a disproportionate responsibility for, and one that we know a number of means through which we can respond to it. So yes, large numbers of people are very likely to move, but it is incumbent upon us as practitioners, I think, to be aware that this is not a process that has to happen in a way that is negatively disruptive to these people and to ourselves in these apocalyptic, Mad Maxian terms. We can and do have the capability to respond in a much more positive way. And so there is, I should say, a number of ongoing responses that are based in 4 key areas of international policy discussion. We have climate change mitigation adaptation, primarily through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. and the IPCC as the scientific component to that. We have refugee and conflict impacted populations, whether they're formal refugees or internally displaced persons due to violence. Those are two well-established areas of policy discourse. We have labor movement and development. I used to work in international migration policy on the side of labor migration, which in and of itself is a very contested area that has ties to environmental disruption, political instability in regions, even though people might not necessarily have the refugee designation. This is an area that is increasingly touching on climate change. And of course, disaster mitigation and management. We have the Sendai framework. There are a number of other international policy instruments related to related to climate change that touch on this. But each of these four areas has, often in the literature and sometimes in practice, thought of itself quite distinctly. There are ongoing efforts in many of these policy spheres to link up and to start to have an interdisciplinary conversation. But at the level of policy instruments, it's very difficult to show the linkages between some of these areas. And I would say particularly when it comes to labor migration and refugee and conflict impacted populations, disaster mitigation, climate change policy, those areas are very difficult to link together. And all this is to say that we need to begin planning and adaptation today. And that's why we're hosting this conversation with you. That's why we hope you'll continue on with us as we explore and stumble and fail and learn about how we can best respond to this challenge. The reality is that there are a number of steps we need to take to see this area realized and protect these people fully, and we want to do whatever we can, to help achieve that. So the existing framework. There are, as I just identified with these four policy areas, there are a lot of particular legal instruments and policy areas that are starting to touch on the idea of climate change, migrants, and refugees. I'm going to cover these at a very broad level because it's very easy to get into the weeds in them. But at the most basic point, the most basic level, these are diverse areas, often very high level in their discussions. There's not a lot of focus on implementation at the level of practitioners, first and foremost. First of all, we have of course, the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees, which was updated in 1967 to include the number of refugees that are not covered under that initial designation, which was in 51 was focused on European refugees. There's the United Nations Environmental Program, which does not have a specific policy focus on climate change migrants, but has increasingly come to recognize them as an area of concern, and a number of the definitions that you'll see related to the idea of climate change migrants as a title are drawn from the UNEP's work. There was a pioneering series of policy papers done by a man named El Hawani from Egypt. His 1985 definition on environmental migrants and refugees was one of the seminal moments really in this emerging in the literature, although his definition and many others remain very contested. And finally, before I go into that one, the final one is worth mentioning is the International Organization for Migration, the IOM. They were initially envisioned as more of a service provision organization at the international level. They're primarily funded by the United States and a number of other northern countries, and their primary purpose was to help with the movement of populations of migrants in the event of a crisis, a natural disaster or conflict, where those people would not receive a refugee designation. So a great example is the Libyan civil war. There were a massive number, millions of migrants from around the world who were there as laborers who, when the conflict broke out, suddenly had nowhere to go. Planes weren't leaving the country. There were not resources to get them out. Their national governments weren't necessarily in a position to help them. So the IOM was there to charter planes, make sure the documents were in order, and help those people move. But the IOM has really grown in the years since its inception, and recently has been actually absorbed by the United Nations, and its director, Peter Sutherland, has been appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on Migration. And the IOM is increasingly taking on what we call in the migration world a rights-based approach. Whereas before it was focused on service provision, meeting the immediate needs of particular groups, now it's focused on more of a rights-based approach. And like many of these things, it's very contested. But as they've been absorbed by the UN, they're now taking on a number of roles, including shepherding various agreements related to migrant protection through the international system. And they're starting to, although I would say not quickly enough, address this idea of climate change, migrants, and refugees. So I'm going to touch again, very quickly here on a number of current important initiatives that are going on. There are so many that I could talk about here. There's a tremendous amount of work being done, particularly at the grassroots level, to address these challenges that we're seeing. But I think that when we talk about the stuff that has global resonance and relevance, I'm going to try and highlight that stuff as best I can. So we have 3 reports here that I just want to mention quickly. So the Nansen Initiative, which was drawn out of the Nansen Initiative was formed after the Cancun Agreement, and there was a particular mention there, thankfully, of climate change migrants and climate-related disruptions to population movements. And so out of that, the Nansen Initiative was formed out of a number of governments from the Nordic region coming together and trying to lay out a process to discuss climate change challenges. So one of the big things that they focused on in this was just trying to understand at a very global level, what are the regions most challenged, what are the particular areas of concern that they have, and what might be some potential solutions that they've seen. And their final report, which was released just last year, includes 12 areas of concern, which I'll mention a little bit later, but details the work that they did in a quite innovative, actually, global consultation where they had different mid-level consultation points on each continent. Each of those fed into a continent region-wide final discussion paper that included an exhaustive list of all the issues that have been gone through. It's pretty fascinating reading, but certainly a lot to go through there. The second one on the far right there is the NOMAD Initiative, which is out of the World Bank. This is an effort to start to bridge a little bit of the concerns around the various drivers of migration, which might be environmental, economic stressors, and providing tools to governments to initiate responses to the economic implications of migrants moving to their country. So helping them create labor force systems, policy responses in labor terms that help them get there. And I should mention that NOMAD has started to actually include a component of local government response. They recognize that local governments and practitioners in local governments have a role to play in the resettlement of migrant populations. If you're a community, for example, that is a large construction, facing a large amount of construction, you're going to be bringing in very likely a large number of migrants, whether internal or external. So there needs to be a policy regime to handle that. And finally, we have the United Nations intent to create a stable global policy mechanism, a convention, very much like the Convention on Refugees, for international migration. They're calling it right now the Global Compact on Safe and Orderly Migration. And it's set to be negotiated over the next 2 years. And there'll be ideally, very likely, a high-level dialogue here in New York in 2019, which will focus on the implementation of the final draft agreement there. This, again, is very, very high level, but the main points to keep in mind for this are that it will be trying to create a wider space, most likely, for migrants to be entering in and out of mostly northern countries and creating a rights-based regime to respect that those people, to make sure those people are getting the rights and respect that they deserve. So looking ahead here, the three big things that I'm going to highlight for us moving forward, which will have some impact on planners in the future, are as follows. So the Paris Accord has no specific mention of climate change migrants and refugees. The Cancun Agreement was relatively unique in this respect. But as adaptation finance moves forward, all the various global mechanisms related to through multilateral development banks, adaptation finance being a big chunk of that, as more of those initiatives gear up towards funding local projects and national and regional initiatives on various aspects of climate finance, we're going to see, I think, 2 crucial things. We're going to see more projects related to the direct protection of populations so that movement isn't necessary, so classic armoring strategies, building dikes, building stormwater surge protection, raising homes, things of that nature. And then I think initially we will start to see projects related to the movement of populations. So understanding that countries, particularly small island developing states, which Ronald Jameau is one of the key actors within, they don't have the resources and they don't have the physical capacity in terms of their land to adapt effectively. There is no way to stop some islands from sinking into the ocean, quite frankly. And in some of those cases, those people will have no choice but to move. So as these mechanisms unfold, there will, I think, we'll see increasing focus on pieces there. And it should be noted that this Peter Sutherland that I mentioned, the UN Special Rapporteur on Migration, has recommended the creation of migration-specific development finance authorities to see that through as well. The Nanchen Initiative, as I mentioned earlier, has continued with its multilateral engagements. These have now concluded, and all of the reports are available on their website. I highly recommend looking at some of them. They have their final report, which I'll just give a few quick highlights from, where they had 12 major findings which they think are going to drive policy creation at the global level with regards to climate change migrants and other disaster-moving people. So displacement is going to be one of the largest humanitarian challenges of the 21st century. That was an overall finding that was emphatically listed throughout all of their engagements. And that really comes down to the numbers. The amount of people that are going to be impacted by climate change and other natural disasters is only going to increase as time goes forward. The second thing that they identified was that many of these migrants are going to be internal. So as I believe we'll be hearing from Sally about, there are many instances, particularly in Canada and the United States, where we have unstable northern climates, where people are going to be moving internally. And in most cases, we don't have a policy regime that responds to that meaningfully, certainly in the Canadian context. And then, as I said earlier, while hazards are a force of nature, disasters are not natural. They happen when a community isn't prepared for an event that comes to them. And that isn't to place blame on that community, but it means that there's not a stable system there to help them respond. And they felt it was necessary to highlight that. Finally, they said that there are going to be many movements, as I think I identified by talking about the legal definition, there are going to be many movements of people that are not refugees. And we need to understand that even if there is an eventual change around the definition of migrant or refugee, that it's more inclusive of environmental drivers, there is very likely going to be a lot of people who move and have no special legal protection. And that's an aspect of our regime that we have to be very concerned about at the global level to make sure that when you or I as planning practitioners are appealing to the national government for funding, let's say, to make sure that we can help settle people more effectively, we understand that we not only have a responsibility as a service provider, but that this is a right as well. And I'll end there with a final point that's important to highlight, which is that this global compact on safe and orderly migration is a unique opportunity for the civil rights community, NGOs, nonprofits, which I've worked in and been involved in these processes for. This is a unique opportunity for us to push, ideally effectively, that this rights-based regime has to be encompassing of a variety of types of migration. Labor migrants who are moving because they simply see a better opportunity for a job or employment elsewhere. But people who are responding to drivers that are subtle and difficult to identify, like the crop yields declining because of changes in weather patterns, that you as a farmer can't make the same amount of money as you used to, so you decide it's time to pack up and do something else. Those are nuances that our global system of refugee and migrant rights and policy parameters does not accurately cover today. And if we're going to be effective as practitioners and if we're going to be effective as a global community, we're going to need to see that happen. And it's very much the hope of the nonprofit community and all the various advocates that are involved in this, that global compact is going to be one answer to that. So I'll leave it for there. I've gone a little bit over time. I apologize, Sally. But I think that hopefully this gives you guys a bit of an overview of where some of the challenges, where some of the opportunities are in climate change, migrants, and advocacy at the global level. So I'll turn it over to Sally.
So good morning. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Alaska. I work for the State of Alaska Division of Community and Regional Affairs, and I've been working with communities in the state that have been dealing with climate change issues for about 11 years. So I have a story to tell. I was first asked, though, to talk to you a little bit about U.S. policy on climate change, and we're just talking about climate change and not policy on climate migrants. U.S. policy on climate change has been very slow to evolve. Although the Clean Air Act amendments passed, there was resistance to regulating greenhouse gases and opposition to ratifying the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. In Alaska, especially during the George W. Bush administration, we began to see some very real impacts of climate change. And I'd like to switch gears and speak briefly about those impacts and some of the ways the state of Alaska has responded. Over the past 60 years, Alaska has warmed more than twice as rapidly as the rest of the United States, with average annual air temperature increasing by nearly 4 degrees Fahrenheit and average winter temperature by nearly 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have frozen ground, when you have permafrost, it makes a big difference. And this warming has had widespread impacts, particularly in the western and northern parts of the state. The extent and thickness of Arctic sea ice has decreased significantly since 1979. The extent of Arctic sea ice in September of 2016, just last fall, was tied with 2007 as the lowest extent on record. The significance of this sea ice is that it's provided a buffer to the impacts of sea storms on coastal communities. Coastal communities are now much more vulnerable to the impacts of coastal storms, which have brought storm surges, flooding, and have also exacerbated coastal erosion. We've seen a significant increase in the number of severe storms and flood events in Alaska, as this chart on federally declared disasters shows. Two of the areas that are most impacted by these events are the Bethel and Yukon-Kayakuk census areas in the western and interior parts of Alaska. Most of the communities in these two census areas are rural, remote, meaning they are only accessible by air or by boat, and they're predominantly Alaska Native. 80% of the land in Alaska is underlain by permafrost, and 70% of this land is vulnerable to subsidence due to permafrost degradation. Thawing permafrost presents considerable challenges for the built environment. It also exacerbates erosion in many coastal and riverine communities. This is a photo of the riverbank at the village of Newtok, a community that has experienced such progressive and severe erosion that the viability of the community is threatened. The ice-rich permafrost layer thaws when exposed to warmer river or seawater, leaving a shelf with no support, and the riverbank continuously sloughs away. And these are some photos of that sloughing at Newtok. The Ningluk River, the river to which Newtok is losing ground, is eroding at an average rate of 72 feet per year, with a maximum rate seen of 300 feet during a coastal storm. Newtok is in an emergency situation to move. We don't believe the community will be viable in 4 years. The photo at the top of the slide was taken by me on my first trip to Newtok in 2006. The photo on the bottom was taken last summer. Note how much land has gone in 10 years. There's not much more land left for that community to lose. So I'm going to run quickly through some of the efforts to address climate change in Alaska. In 2003, the village of Newtok completed a land exchange with the federal government for a new village site, Buktarvik, on Nelson Island. That same year, the U.S. Government Accountability Office completed its first report on Alaska Native villages threatened by flooding and erosion. The report found that 184 out of 213, or 86%, of Alaska Native villages were affected by flooding and erosion to some extent, and 4 villages were in imminent danger from flooding and erosion, including Newtok, and planning to relocate. The report really shed light on the rapidly growing threat that a warming climate was having on Alaska Native villages. In 2006, the tribal leadership of Newtok came to my agency at the state and asked for help with their relocation effort. I was tasked with helping Newtok, and shortly thereafter we formed the Newtok Planning Group, an interagency working group that has been assisting Newtok with its relocation effort. The following year, the village of Kivalina, another imminently threatened community, attempted to self-evacuate during a severe fall storm. The evacuation effort was very risky, but unfortunately no one was harmed. This was a wake-up call to state leadership, however, that the state of Alaska needed to respond to the needs of imminently threatened communities. So the governor established the Alaska Climate Change Subcabinet, which was charged with preparing and implementing a climate change strategy for Alaska. Under this subcabinet, the Immediate Action Working Group was charged with coming up with a plan to address the needs of Alaska's imminently threatened communities. And to my knowledge, this is probably the first formal state government effort in the country to address the needs of climate migrants. That same year, an erosion hearing was held in Anchorage by Senators Stevens and Landrieu, calling further attention to imminently threatened communities. And the takeaway from this hearing was that both the state and the federal governments needed to respond quickly to this rapidly emerging problem. The state's response was the Alaska Climate Change Impact Mitigation Program, which was intended to help communities develop a planned approach to climate adaptation. And I was put in charge of that program, and I'll talk about it briefly in a bit. A climate change strategy was developed, and the Government Accountability Office completed a follow-up report on Alaska Native villages, which found that although Newtok had made progress with its relocation with help from the Newtok Planning Group and the Immediate Action Working Group, the other imminently threatened communities had made little progress. In 2010, we began work on Newtok's relocation strategy, the McTarvik Strategic Management Plan. And 1 year later, the work of the Climate Change Subcabinet and the Immediate Action Working Group came to a screeching halt. A new state administration was in place, and climate change was no longer a priority, although planning efforts at my level continued, but we didn't have the high-level support that we had in the several years before this. So these are some of the basic principles we followed through our planning efforts. First, the community must be the key player in the decision-making process. We're there to assist them, but it's about them and their future. Assistance to imperiled communities should be based on a fair and defensible methodology. Imperiled communities and the agencies assisting them need quantifiable data. And this is really important because in Alaska we are really data poor, and it's been very difficult to get funding to study the west coast and northern part of Alaska. And then a coordinated, thoughtfully planned approach, interdisciplinary approach, is really necessary. So the Alaska Climate Change Impact Mitigation Program was intended to help communities come up with a planned approach to adaptation. Basic to this process was an understanding of the risk they were dealing with and some of the actions they could take to adapt to that risk. The program was carried out in 2 steps. First, the hazard impact assessment, the data collection risk assessment step, and secondly, the community adaptation planning stage, where resources were provided to implement some of the actions identified in the hazard impact assessment. 6 communities conducted hazard impact assessments, and 8 conducted community adaptation planning efforts. We don't have time to go over all the projects that came out of the program, but the village of Shishmaref provides an excellent example of what the process can do. Shishmaref is an imminently threatened community that is temporarily protected by a seawall, but looking at relocation as a permanent solution. The people of Shishmaref used their community adaptation planning grant to conduct a relocation site feasibility study. During this process, they narrowed the choice to 2 alternative relocation sites. And then last year, in August of 2016, they held an election and a majority of the community voted to relocate. They have now selected a final site, and the relocation planning process will begin soon. But this decision has not been easy for Shishmaref, and there is great concern in the community about how relocation will take place and be funded. I'm going to take a quick sip of water because I'm doing a lot of talking. From 2011 through 2012, we began the process of developing Newtok's relocation strategy. And I'd like to actually acknowledge two of the contractors that are sitting in the audience from Agnew Beck that worked on that project. It's great to see them again. The strategic management plan has been guiding Newtalk's relocation process ever since. The plan provides a collective vision for Newtalk's relocation, lays out the relocation phases, and facilitates partnerships for leveraging resources and reducing construction conflicts. To supplement the plan, we provided graphic versions with Yupik words, which is the first language in Newtalk. The relocation phases are based on the number of people living at the new village site and the infrastructure and facilities needed to support the population at each phase. And this is an aerial photo of Mukhtarvik, Newtalk's new village site under development. Development has taken place through a number of partnerships between state and federal agencies involved with the Newtalk Planning Group. And this summer, several new roads will be developed, the shell of the evacuation shelter will be built, and several new homes will be constructed. Between 2014 and 2016, we conducted the Alaska Community Coastal Protection Project. The project is based on the model provided by the Newtalk Planning Group and the development of Newtalk's strategic management plan. And it focuses on 3 imminently threatened communities that are looking at relocation potentially: Kivalina, Shishmaref, and Shaktoolik. There are 3 essential components of this process, and it's similar to what I talked about with Newtalk. Funding was dedicated to community coordinators in each of the 3 communities to serve as community champions and really be the glue to the process for each community. We also provided travel funding to community leadership to ensure that they could participate in planning meetings, because that was really essential. Interagency working groups were established based on the Newtalk Planning Group model, and the agencies provided assistance to the community and planning team as the strategic management plans were developed. And this is a diagram of the process we followed to develop the plans. During the first year, we worked only with the 3 communities to identify issues, values, goals, and objectives through literature review, surveys, interviews, and a community gathering. This resulted in a background planning report which provided the foundation for the strategic management plan. The interagency working groups were formed the second year. They worked with the communities to identify and prioritize strategic actions that would later be implemented to achieve each community's adaptation goals. A final community gathering was held to review the draft strategic management plan. And this diagram shows how adaptation actions were prioritized for the plan. Strategic focus areas are shown on the circumference of the circle. Actions were prioritized by each community based on urgency and funding availability. The plans were completed in September of 2016 and are available online. So now I'm going to go back to U.S. policy on climate change. A lot happened at the end of President Obama's second term. He signed 2 executive orders relating to climate change, one which established the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, whose purpose is to enhance coordination of federal Arctic policies. A community resilience working group was established, which, similar to the state's immediate action working group, has been looking at the needs of climate-threatened communities in Alaska. In the fall of 2015, he came to Alaska and he announced a number of initiatives to address climate change in the Arctic, including tasking the Denali Commission with coordinating federal efforts to build climate resilience in remote Alaskan communities. And on September 3rd of 2016, the U.S. formally joined the Paris Agreement. And now we have the Trump administration. Trump rescinded Executive Order 13653 on March 28, 2017. In his campaign, he called climate change a hoax. We don't know what will happen with U.S. involvement in the Paris Agreement, and there is certainly uncertainty about what the next 4 years will hold in terms of climate change policy. So, where do we go from here? Well, I'm currently working with the Department of the Interior and other federal agencies on developing an adaptive relocation framework for Alaska Native villages. And I'm really hopeful that they'll be able to continue working on that. We're going to try to get things wrapped up by the end of this year. So I think everybody feels pretty optimistic that we'll be able to accomplish that. I coordinate FEMA's Risk Map program in Alaska, and I'm developing a new focus on Alaska Native villages. The program will provide some of the same tools and resources that the Alaska Climate Change Impact Mitigation Program provided. But two of the biggest dilemmas I've encountered during this process, of course, is the pendulum swinging with politics. How do we ensure support for these efforts to help impacted communities despite administrative changes? Because we've seen it both at the state and the federal level. And while people like me can continue to be working on the ground, it's really difficult to accomplish big things if you don't have high-level support. And then how do we ensure committed funding? That's the other issue. So that's the end of what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. That's a phenomenal amount of detail, and I think adds an element of tangibility to this challenge, to see a community facing that so dramatically, just the range of pictures at the top here. I hope that gives us a clear idea of the challenge that we face. One of the themes that I think rose in your presentation there that I want to highlight is the need for collaboration. And it's almost a cliche to say this as planners, that we need to collaborate more. But I think as these examples show, it's essential, it's imperative that we have actors at different scalar levels and thematically collaborating across all levels and laterally with one another to achieve something. And so I think the example that Anna as well was going to speak about next with regards to the ISS of BC will really highlight a lot of that. So Anna.
Thanks, George. So something that's really interesting about settlement or resettlement is that it can really happen in a lot of ways. It can be predictable, like in a lot of what Sally was talking about, and more proactive, but in a lot of situations where cities themselves and municipalities are dealing with the absorption of increased migration or refugees landing in your city, is that a lot of that can't be predicted. And so today I'm going to talk about a case study where just in the past couple years, Canada has seen quite an influx of Syrian refugees coming in, and it's kind of a good example to compare because it was unexpected and municipalities were not prepared for it. So I kind of want to talk about the role of ISSBC, and I'll explain what that is and what it allowed it to successfully absorb 40,000 people or actually, this is in the province of BC, but in Canada, we absorbed around 40,000 Syrian refugees. So I kind of want to talk to the success factors that allowed it to do so effectively, and also the lessons learned from that. So part of that, just to start it off, is that the network in British Columbia of service providers, whether it's ISSBC, which is a government-funded mandated service provider, or other not-for-profits and non-governmental organizations, there's a really robust network of service provision that already exists because, as you may know, I mean, Canada as well as the United States were made of immigrants, and so we are obviously used to having newcomers into our cities and into our provinces and states. So we're not new to resettling and trying to welcome people into our countries, but it is quite a difference when it comes in such a large volume. So today, I'm going to present on some material that Chris Friesen, the director of the Immigrant Society, Service Society of British Columbia, has provided me, and unfortunately he couldn't join us today. But there's a lot of great information that he was able to provide us that shed some light on what it takes to really successfully resettle and settle immigrants and refugees. I'm going to talk about the Vancouver Welcome House as a best practice example of how that can be done at the local level, as well as some details on how the Syrian refugee crisis has happened in the past and how it's moving forward now. So the Immigrant Service Society of British Columbia is the oldest not-for-profit immigrant serving society in British Columbia. It is basically a subcontractor to our national government to provide settlement services to really anybody that requires from the low end of the spectrum just a little bit of support, or if you're coming and English is your second language, you can go there and receive language supports. Or to the other side of the spectrum of you're here and you're completely vulnerable, you have no assets, you have no housing, what do you do? So it serves over 30,000 immigrants and refugees annually. This year we've seen a spike, obviously. Not a huge spike, actually, but so it's actually quite, I'll get into how, I guess, the Syrian refugee crisis, it really challenged what we do normally on a day-to-day basis, but at the same time, because we've done this a lot in the past, it was actually quite successful. And that's also because it has that robust structure of 300 staff, 800 active volunteers, as well as 20 sites of service within the province, many of which are located and concentrated in urban areas, but also in the interior of BC as well. So just basic key resettlement challenges that ISS of BC over the years that it's operated has seen and tries to address are language challenges, finding employment, access to basic services, social integration, and housing. And one of, I guess, out of these decades of resettling newcomers, what we found is that the biggest challenges have to do with not the lack of services, but rather the coordination between all the service providers. We actually have a very robust structure that there's tons of NGOs that exist in our province, but the problem is that they're geographically scattered and there's a lack of coordination between these agencies. So something that ISS of BC has been working on for many, many years now is the Vancouver Welcome House. And what that project tries to do is to try and bring all of these service providers under one roof. And I have a little video to kind of show you what that might look like. Anyone else having internet challenges? Sorry, bear with me here. Whoa.
If you have a dream, then at least you know you have a goal, you have a chance of pursuing these goals, you have something to look forward.
It's truly been a dream of the organization for a very long time.
If we were able to provide all of the immediate programs and services that a newcomer, an immigrant, or refugee would require under one roof, that it would have more impact as far as their settlement outcomes.
Working with the neighborhood, working with the community to really becoming a focal point for newcomers.
This is a world-class leading-edge facility for refugees and newcomers, and Vancouver is a city of immigrants. ISS BC has provided incredible service for decades to newcomers in Vancouver, and this will be an opportunity to bring many services together, people of all cultures, and really be the best in the world at serving refugees and newcomers to Vancouver.
And then it has to be good for the world. And this building is environmentally sustainable. It's a LEED Gold building, but it also has a whole program which helps people circumnavigate their integration into our country.
How much benefit it would provide keeping all these services at one point, at one place, where you are able to find your housing needs, you are able to find your language needs.
But we're also bringing together a collection of other organizations and public institutions, leveraging their expertise and resources for the betterment of newcomers to BC.
We're just so excited about the opportunity to partner with ISSBC and to create a physical representation of what creating community for new Canadians really looks like.
From inception or conception to actual implementation, it's taken dozens and dozens and dozens of people to get us here over a long period of time. The Centre is truly a multi-service organization and will provide services for people who need the most help to those who need support and encouragement.
We can now provide temporary housing, orientation and settlement, language training, and employment support, and a range of additional services under one roof.
Really hope that this building is a great success for the new immigrants that come here to Canada. Haitep Elisiam Nasiaya, Collect Quincy Tala, Tashwala Inam, E Tanawe, Haitep Garcia. Thank you very much.
So as that video kind of highlights, the special thing about the Welcome Center is that it combines a lot of what ISSBC as well as other subsidiaries are trying to do, and to place it in one geographic location that is accessible by transit, that is a hub in a regional sense. It's actually in one of the most highly used transit stations in Metro Vancouver. And it offers housing, healthcare, meeting spaces, language support, educational options, as well as a bunch of offices at all levels of government that a newcomer to a city might need. So that's something we really wanted to highlight as one of the biggest achievements through ISSBC so far, and it will continue to serve thousands of people. The biggest contributors and success factors to how this all came to be actually stemmed from a lot of political leadership at the city level. Consensus by council to allow this development project to go through, as well as several other financial contributions through land leases. The space that it sits was actually municipally owned land prior to them developing on it. So access to this kind of land and its ability to develop as a social purpose shared space was made possible by reductions in zoning and development permit fees, property tax exemptions, basically all of the administrative barriers and financial barriers that prevent a not-for-profit association to pursue a project like this. They were really able to partner with the city in order to make it happen. There was also a collaborative effort with the Van City, the local credit union, who offered a capital grant that made this project possible. The provincial and federal contributions are quite hefty as well, but you can see that what it really takes is, the biggest part of this is really real estate, if you think about it. Like, if you're in a city where you're already strapped for space, and you're looking for prime real estate that's close to transit, that's accessible to many in your region, the city can really, really have a large role to play in that. And so that's something to consider as we move forward. And obviously, as was mentioned, the community benefits from this kind of a facility is really the accessibility, the one-stop shop, offering social and economic integration, as well as saving time and financial resources by increasing that kind of efficiency and impact of government funding support. And it improves collaboration and exchange of ideas in the same way that people in cities, there's that effect of if people exist in the same place, there's a lot of creativity that can happen in how you can make your work a lot more impactful. So I'm going to move into talking a little bit about specifically what has been going on around the resettlement of Syrian refugees over the past couple of years. So since November 2015, we've received, like I said, just over 40,000 refugees to Canada. Those that come to BC, this kind of breaks it down so you have a little idea of the makeup. GARs are government-assisted refugees. BVORs are blended visa office referred, which means they go through the UNHCR program. And privately sponsored refugees, basically anyone, a citizen of Canada, can apply to privately sponsored refugees. So there is actually quite a large proportion of the UN-sponsored and privately sponsored ones. The age cohort, because a lot of the eligibility criteria seeks to cover and protect those that are most vulnerable, so children, disabled, make up a quite large proportion, which really affects, if you think about it later on, I'm going to touch on what cities and what planners should really think about. You can kind of already imagine, if you have such a young population coming in, school systems are heavily affected, as well as daycare facilities. There's tons of these kinds of services that planners do deal with in their work, so keep that in mind. This is just a graph that kind of shows the rate at which the Syrian refugees arrived to Canada, and this really highlights like I said before, this number that came in is not actually a huge spike when you think of annual average, but what's unique here is that it came all at once. So how do you deal with what normally you would deal with over an entire year within the time span of 2 months and trying to resettle, provide temporary and permanent housing for these people? So at the 1-year mark last year, ISSBC released a study that kind of reports on where are we now in this whole situation. So this shows where the refugees have settled. And as you can see, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the geography of Vancouver, but Vancouver, as you can see, is the far western side, but the surrounding suburbs, they all make up Metro Vancouver. And a lot of that resettlement has happened in the eastern suburbs, mainly because of housing affordability. It's quite a hot topic in Vancouver right now. We're one of the most unaffordable cities in the world, so that's a problem in itself. But Surrey and Burnaby have really absorbed the most in our region, and that's mostly because of their ability to grow in housing and development, but also because of their capacity in terms of cultural diversity. Surrey is one of the most diverse municipalities in our region, and so there's a lot of cultural support for that exists there already, which makes it a really viable area for resettlement. As part of this 1-year follow-up, what was also done was a youth consultation session where they were able to really target youth refugees as stakeholders, because as you saw in that pie chart, there are so many young people coming, and really what this shows here is that the continuity of engaging with refugees as stakeholders is paramount. A lot of these settlement services offer immediate services to when you first arrive. How do you find housing? How do you find employment? But after a year, after the government assistance program of income. The government basically offers income assistance for a year after you arrive, but what happens after that? Well, it's really important to follow up at whatever marker, at 1 year, 5 year, to really see what progress are we making and where are we lacking in services. So that's something to really keep in mind as planners who think in the long run. Keeping refugees in mind even after the immediate emergency resettlement process is really important. As you can imagine, after a year of settling somewhere, it's not perfect. There are a lot of problems that still need to be addressed, but something I wanted to highlight was something that's the most relevant to planning, and I'd say it's infrastructure. Housing infrastructure is one of them. When we think about housing, we think about affordability, but what is actually a huge problem in North American cities is that when larger family sizes are coming in, we don't build for families that are larger than, what's the average, like 4, 5, 6 maybe? A lot of these refugees coming have families of 8, 9, 10. Like, how do you house a family that you have not predicted or forecasted for? That's one of the biggest challenges, is that when families do find the housing that's suitable for them, it actually breaks occupancy regulations, or like you're not actually allowed to fit 8 people in this in this dwelling. So it's something that is actually in the realm of municipal regulation that we really need to think about and reflect on. Rent, obviously, I mean, affordability of housing, as you can imagine, goes beyond municipalities, and there's a lot we need to work on in that sense, but really getting those low-hanging fruit to improve accessibility and affordability of housing for newcomers is a huge part. So to conclude, I kind of want to provide a few, I guess, not necessarily recommendations, but I want to throw a few things out there that Chris Friesen and I talked about when we had our little conversation. And that's, I asked him, what can cities do to help support what ISS of BC is doing? And what can planners specifically in their own profession do? So one of these things for what can cities and municipalities do is to start to lead local immigration partnership tables if they don't exist already. And it's a platform for which local organizations and existing service providers, all trying to pursue the same goal and have the same mandates, bring them to the table and to talk about what is missing. What do you need from your municipal government? What do you need from your federal government? And it's really getting those people together to have those conversations that you're going to really find out where the problems are. Establish a mayor's task force, if it doesn't exist already, and to consider possible uses that may be unconventional for your municipal real estate assets as either neighborhood or regional hubs for service provision. I'm not sure what the US has right now, but in Canada, in Vancouver, we have these neighborhood houses that provide a space where anyone in the neighborhood, they're almost like community centers, but they're a lot more culturally sensitive and offer services that normally community centers wouldn't. So if those are already existing, figure out ways that how you can leverage those real estate assets to make it even more effective and even more impactful in your community, not for only the people that live there now, but for the possible future populations as well. And something that I've talked a lot about housing, but there's also a lot of other infrastructure that we can really think about when we talk about the local capacity for absorption. Social services, housing of course, municipal services, employment, school capacity to absorb all these children that may potentially come in the next few decades. We need to start forecasting for a lot more variety and a lot more of a range of incoming in-migration. What we learned in planning school, how do you forecast for future growth. And a lot of what we do now is you backcast and then you project that forward. But in our generation, we're going to see rapid increases in influxes and changes in migration globally. So that's something we really need to think about when we go through our analyses and forecasting models. So bringing that into the city processes for planning is essential. And of course, as George mentioned, cross-jurisdictional collaboration and partnerships are going to be super important in breaking down the silos of conversations that are happening at the global level, international, as well as the provincial or state and municipal level. So planning as a profession, how can we in our own jobs do, or what can we do, and how can we leverage our own skills and our positions to adequately address this issue? First thing would be to advocate and be an advocate for refugees and immigrants within your own governance structures. Wherever you might work, whether it's social planning, resilience planning, infrastructure planning, housing policy, keep this in the back of your mind because it is going to become a super salient issue in the near future. As you're going through planning processes, think about refugees and immigrants as stakeholders if you don't already, and be mindful of the specific barriers, whether it's language or cultural, or what their vulnerabilities are. Keep that in your public consultation processes. And like I mentioned before, the follow-up of resettlement processes is going to be really important in learning, how have we failed and how can we improve. I had mentioned before that a lot of the social purpose real estate and shared spaces that is paramount to getting these stakeholders in one space is going to need a lot of municipal partnership in order to make that happen through development and permitting structures, through financing structures, through land leases, whatever that is. Really find those opportunities to make real estate development possible for these social purpose real estate projects. And the last two would be, I've already kind of touched on that, as well as housing typologies once again. When we think about housing, and I'm not suggesting that we need to completely change our policies and say, we should be able to allow for a dwelling to accommodate 10 people and that should become the new norm. It's more to do with thinking about how we can make our housing in general more adaptable to the varied needs that may arise. And that might even be, multi-generational housing, co-op housing, different forms of land use, or not land use, but of housing typology, as well as, what's the word I'm looking for? The size and the composition, as well as whether it's rental or affordable ownership. A lot of these are very related to what our current populations need, but keeping refugees and immigrants in mind will actually augment the impact that these things will have in the future. So lastly, I just want to invite you to come to me with any questions, with any specific questions of the case studies. Chris Friesen was really hoping to be here, but he could not make it, but he basically extends an open invitation to anybody who wants to learn more about the Welcome House, as well as what ISS of BC does, so feel free to contact him. His email is up there. And I also have a few pamphlets that Chris was able to give me. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more about the nuts and bolts of even the architecture of how this Welcome House is designed, there are some really, really interesting little details of what they've done to make this space as welcoming and as effective as it currently runs. So yeah, thank you.
I realize a lot of you folks probably have to run off to lunch, and I apologize that we've run a little bit late here. I'm sure that's the same apology you get at every session at this conference, but hopefully that gives you a sense that there's a lot to talk about here and that there's a lot of issues that we want to address. I want to propose that if any of you folks are willing to sit around for a few more minutes, we'd be more than happy to answer questions. I don't see that this room is being occupied right away, so as long as you folks are able to sit for a few more minutes, we'd be happy to have this conversation. If you do have to leave, I would just ask, if you're interested in this topic and you want to throw a business card on the table for us to get in touch with you, we're going to be reaching out to folks in the coming weeks. We have prepared a number of workshop presentations for different conferences coming up. So next week we'll be at the Canadian Association of Forced Migrants and Refugee Studies National Conference, where we'll be doing a workshop more or less on the opposite of this. We'll be talking to migration academics to help them understand what planners have to bring to the table, whereas we're hoping that we've given you guys a bit of an idea of what the migration side of things, how that's going to impact your profession. So there's a lot there. As I said, please leave us a contact if you have to run, but if you have some time to stick around, we'd love to chat with you some more. So before we jump in, and you can just give me 1 sec, how we'd like to structure this is we'd like to take a few questions right off the bat for some clarification, and if we can kind of squeeze in 5 minutes at the end where we can pose a few things to you guys as well, we'd love to do that. So please jump in.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I actually don't have a question for you folks. Instead, I just want to thank you very much for your presentation. Sally, great to see you, and thanks for the acknowledgement. Instead, I wanted to announce that this evening, related to this topic, this evening there is a gathering of kind of reinvigorating the Indigenous Planning Division of the American Planning Association. There's a meeting from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at the Marriott Marquis. I have flyers here. We'll have food and beverages. We would be very excited to see you guys. To date, that division has been pretty inactive, so we're reinvigorating that group and very excited to have tribal planners, Indigenous planners, folks that are planning for tribal communities, Indigenous communities. We'd be very excited to see you. So my name is Shelley. Happy to give you a flyer. Excited to see you tonight. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Hubner with the Puget Sound Regional Council in Seattle, Washington, so nearby Vancouver, BC.
Good to see you.
Great job on the presentation. This is a hugely important topic with a couple of, I don't think we can do justice to the several dimensions to it that you referenced. One is certainly the refugees and migrants from internationally. I'm proud that the Seattle region has been very welcoming of refugees, but one of the uncertainties in federal policy is certainly refugee and immigration policy. We don't know how that's going to play out. As a regional planner, we're also getting pressure to deal with, and I'm glad you referenced the forecasting uncertainties, forecasting of internal migration or changes in growth patterns. These are very different issues, but I think that they're related. So one is a question for you all or anybody else in the room is, we agree we can't forecast what the future is going to look like, but what it seems to be the approach forward is to do some really robust scenario planning to get policymakers and the public starting to engage in questions about an uncertain future and plan for them. And the point I want to make about that in terms of role as planners is, as witnessed by what's going on throughout Europe, the United States, around immigration and refugee policy, I think the better job that we can do as planners to prepare our communities for an uncertain future and an influx, if you will. I almost have a kind of pejorative flavor to it, but the rise in people coming to regions, especially ones that have comfortable climates and ample water like the Pacific Northwest, prepare communities for that. I think there's a less chance of a backlash in future years, and I'm afraid that there is a risk of that. So those are some sort of thoughts and questions put out there, but thank you for this presentation. Great work.
Thank you. Just to jump in here really quickly, I think, thank you so much for that comment, and certainly coming from the Pacific Northwest, which, as you said, has abundant food and water. We don't like to think in these starker terms as planners, but in a world facing dramatic climatic uncertainty, those are two crucial features of a place that you want to live. And I think I want to ask Sally if she can speak more to the idea of internal migrants, but most definitely in the United States and Canada, people are going to move, and probably move quite a lot as a result of climatic uncertainty and impacts. So it's very, very timely, and what I hope I've laid out with some of this global policy context is that that's a feature, if you will, that's a variable to enter into the scenario planning exercises to say, well, are we going to have a really restrictive regime of refugee and immigration intake, or are we going to have a more friendly and welcoming one that has, for example, Canada has a points-based system for immigration. Are we going to go towards something like that, or is it going to be needs-based, countries that are most impacted? Those are all variables that we have to be entering into the equation, so I'm glad you raised those. Sally, do you want to talk about the
Sure. I guess, what specifically, because I'm not sure what specific.
Well, just, you've worked with, you are working with effectively internal migrants within Alaska,
Yeah.
so, do you see that, do you see your work as potentially being something that you would like to see carried forward in other communities that might
Oh,
face?
absolutely. And I think the thing that's a little bit different with the communities in Alaska that are facing relocation is that they are really trying to stay within the traditional areas that they've inhabited over, decades when they were nomadic before. So, although communities have settled in sedentary villages, their area of familiarity, their cultural area is much broader. And so the big challenge in Alaska is finding suitable places to move to that don't have the same issues that they're dealing with right now. And of course, we're faced with this conundrum of, some of the best places to find subsistence resources are wetland areas, which are not well suited to modern development. So I think the big challenge for the future for Alaska's communities are going to be a combination of, having the right data to be able to determine whether a place is constructible or not, and having appropriate technology in some of these coastal areas, which the model that we've had for developing rural villages has not been conducive to building in these environmental areas.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, sir.
Sure. Thanks. So Sally and all of you really appreciated the good presentations, and trying to find optimism in areas where there's a lot of things to be discouraged about. Something, Sally, you've described, I've heard you describe before, I think it's worth shining a light on, which is the interagency work group that you had. You talked about how it went maybe through two phases of, here are all the obstacles, here are the EISs, here are the constraints that policy places on us, and then you described how eventually they kind of switched mental gears and started thinking, how can we do creative workarounds to solve problems that initially seemed insurmountable? So maybe you just give an example or elaborate on that slightly, because I've always liked that story.
Just clarify again, Chris, because I'm not hearing all of what you just said. What did you?
Oh, sorry if I spoke too quickly. I just know, if I recall correctly, you talking about the interagency work group, like on Newtok-Murtarvik,
right.
Finding a lot of really creative workarounds to what initially seemed like federal policy constraints, problems that were hardwired into the normal way people try to solve these problems. And they all, from the military to the people who do EISs, begin to find interesting ways to sneak around those boundaries.
Right, and so, that's, well, there's some things that we haven't been able to tackle and that we've had to, push up as policy issues. But, it's, the way that we've been doing this is not the most efficient way to do it, but it's the way that we've been forced to do it. So, funding has been the big issue. If we had committed funding, we could do a very thorough planning process and move things ahead. But we've been doing it in a patchwork way, and we've been having to think outside the box. So, as you're familiar, one of our biggest issues that we had to do was meet some of the prerequisites for funding that some of the federal funders have, and population is a big one. And so the big challenge is, how do we get population, a critical mass of people here, to have FAA think about coming in and building an airport, or having a school district coming in and building a new school. And that's been extraordinarily challenging, though. We're experiencing that with Newtok, where people really can't move over until they have housing, and housing has proven to be one of the most difficult things to get funding for. And especially in an indigenous community where you've got a mixed cash subsistence economy, where people don't really have enough income to handle a regular conventional mortgage. That's the big issue.
So, sir, we'll take your question, then hoping we can do a bit of a kind of popcorn. We've got some questions for you, and we'll kind of throw them out rapid fire, and if you could respond real quickly, then we can maybe get a sense of some of the stuff that's going on in the room.
Okay, thank you. I'm Bill Fair from Key Biscayne, Florida.
Sorry, say again?
Bill Fair from Key Biscayne, Florida. As you know, we're dealing with quite a few issues down there, Miami Beach and Key Biscayne. And your presentation has been very interesting in dealing with the, I guess, local, at the smaller scale level. But does anybody have feedback as to what's going to go on at the larger scale, what the federal government has in mind for these, large, like New York, for example, where, things are maybe in the long run going to go underwater? How are we going to relocate all these people? Because, are we going to just, are there other measures in mind, or, I know in Miami Beach we're raising all our streets right now 3 feet, and all the public spaces, which has been a tremendous undertaking. But I mean, we're looking at the whole East Coast. Does anybody have any input on that? Or what's going on at the federal?
I think you've really hit on the reason why we're starting this conversation now, because no, and not to be glib, because I mean, I don't know if any of you folks were in Phoenix last year, but John Englander did a great presentation at the end of the conference and talking about sea level rise, and he was highlighting a few, I would call them boutique examples of adaptation to storm level rise, to sea level rise. Talking about the Big U here in New York City. That's a fabulously complex, phenomenally expensive undertaking. Yeah. Can we do that on a national scale? Can we do that on a global scale? The answer is a resounding no.
Right.
And something that we've been involved with at the school and at UBC is, it's a very unpopular word, but to say it out loud, retreat. To retreat from areas that are the most threatened by climatic disasters and ongoing shifts, whether that's drought or sea level rise, et cetera, et cetera. And in many ways, that's a mapping exercise at the start, is to start to say, okay, what are the areas most physically threatened that we just can't pour money into endlessly, that we're gonna have to ask people to move out of? And then you start getting into really fun questions about like eminent domain, and are you paying people? There's a municipality, again, this is very micro, but there's a municipality in Greater Vancouver that has been paying people out of their properties along coastal threatened areas. They just said, we don't want to have to keep responding to these challenges year after year. We're not going to build a giant dike. We're going to buy you out at market value, and that's the end of it. Now, that's a small issue. If you start blowing that up to a national scale, it becomes very challenging. Yeah. And so that's why we're raising this conversation now, is to say, how do we start to plan for that at that larger scale by interconnecting communities' responses, rather than just having Miami does one thing and New York City does another and Vancouver does another, and we think bigger than that. So with that said, and I hope that answers your question, if we can pop up, if people want to just shout out, we kind of have 3 overarching questions for folks, which is just, has your community thought about climate migrants at all? And if so, are there any opportunities that you identified in addressing that challenge? Anything at all, from the very small to the very big? And thirdly, what are the tools that you're looking to hearing? Is it mapping? Is it legal precedent for eminent domain? It could be anything, but what are those things? So has your community thought of this? What are any opportunities you've seen to push back against that challenge, and what are you looking for moving forward in terms of tools? Because these are certainly things that we're going to be looking to develop in the coming months and years, and we'll all need to be on board with. So I'll throw it out to anyone who wants to shout out something, if at all. And the answer can be no. If you haven't thought of it, that's perfectly fine. Miss, I think you. Yeah, sure.
So I don't just shout. I actually wanted to raise a point. I do. So this is an opportunity I see. I do a lot of work in fair housing, and have been working with HUD here in the States on affirmatively furthering fair housing. And I'm from Apt Associates, and I have a colleague in Baton Rouge who's starting to talk with the state of Louisiana, because they're looking at redevelopment, relocation. And for me, I see an intersection and an opportunity to kind of not do the mistakes of the past with respect to, and I had a question too about what's happening in British Columbia, about resettlement of people where there's a lot of affordable housing. Those areas are often distressed. I know I'm from Massachusetts, the communities where people are resettled don't have a lot of opportunity, whether it be school or access to jobs. So I see an opportunity in a sense of kind of killing two birds with one stone, or leveraging some of what HUD's policies are in terms of, at least in the States, providing opportunity for people, and mobility is a big aspect of that, and leveraging what needs to be done on the climate side with what resources are available at HUD to create more inclusive communities that have opportunity to lots of people. So I don't know if you've thought of that, but that's one opportunity, and I'd be interested in giving you my card and talking with you more about it.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah, one thing I kind of wanted to mention as well is that you've hit a point where a lot of federal and international funding for a lot of these crises and responses to crises are reactive, are emergency oriented, and they don't actually, something that, I was at the UN Habitat, and one of the panels was actually the, do you remember his title? It was like the Minister of Public Works and Public Works in the Kingdom of Jordan, and he was speaking to how the Kingdom of Jordan has responded to the Syrian refugee crisis as well. And one of the biggest problems is that a lot of the international funding has been toward emergency relief, but what they really need is infrastructure, is development, urban development funding, to fund their roads, their sewage systems that have been that are over capacity, and housing was a huge one too. And how do you fund all that urban development with emergency funding that is designated for that? So that's something that we're really going to have to talk about at the international, but as well as internally at the federal level as well. How is the federal government planning on supporting cities? Because municipal tools are not enough to support these global issues. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Any other final, yeah?
So maybe not necessarily related specifically to climate migrants, but migrants and immigrants in general, but certainly very, very widely applicable. I think I'm from a community in Illinois right now, a small city, if you will, a large town, that is trying to create a very similar center to the one they have in Vancouver, right? One that will kind of integrate services across society, across different
coordination by proximity, I think, is maybe one way to think of it. So I saw one more hand there, and then we should probably get last out, but please come and connect with us afterwards. Did you have a quick question, or? Yeah.
For both, depending on the organization. Like this has become ISS of BC's Vancouver headquarter or BC headquarters, but and for a lot of the organizations that Kristen was mentioning, the larger ones, they've relocated from smaller locations all over the region to here, so that it's become the central hub. But then there's also, say for example, a satellite office for Vancouver Police, as well as satellite office for the Vancouver Public Library Network. So these little things that, as a newcomer, you'd kind of have to bus around and transit around to really get organized. We're trying to bring it all together. And one big thing that I can't remember if I mentioned was banking services. So something that ISS of BC has done is work with Van City Credit Union to develop a new way of banking that is focused primarily to refugees, because like we mentioned, there's a lot of financial services that really exclude vulnerable populations from access. So it's these kind of little partnerships and collaborative efforts that are making things a lot easier for someone who's coming here with not a lot to start with.
Okay, thank you so much, all of you, for taking a little bit extra time with us. We really appreciate it. And if you haven't dropped off a card already, or you haven't come and said hello, please do. We'd love to connect with you. This is a project we're going to be working on for a while yet to come, so we want to be engaging with folks as we do that. So thank you again so much.
We also have a few pamphlets if you want a facility guide to the Welcome Center. It just has some more details, so feel free to come up and grab one. Thank you.